Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Using Electives Effectively to Help Residents Attain Competency in the Core Outcomes. This is the 10th installment of this webinar series focused on navigating the shift to competency-based medical education, brought to you by STFM and the AFMRD with support from the ABFM Foundation. Today's webinar features Dr. Lynn Bateson, Associate Program Director for Curriculum at Kaiser Permanente, Washington, and Dr. Fred Meiser, Professor Emeritus of The Ohio State University Family Medicine Residency Program. During this webinar, you may utilize the Q&A feature to ask questions of the panelists. Although you may ask questions at any time, designated time has been set aside to answer your questions and share your experiences toward the end of the presentation. We hope to see you at our next webinar, The Role of Resident Portfolios in Competency-Based Assessment, on October 9th. You may register for this webinar and access the previous webinars in this series at stfm.org/CBME webinars. And now, Dr. Bateson will begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jenny. Fred and I are very pleased to be here with you today to talk about using elective experiences effectively in residency. We have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And as a reminder, this webinar is one in a series of webinars dedicated to CBME topics sponsored by STFM and AFMRD, and this is the 10th installment. Let's start off with a survey of the room. Our first poll question is, how familiar are you with the current ACGME guidelines for elective experiences? Please go ahead and vote now. Thank you. Looks like most folks are very familiar or familiar. A couple of people have somewhat of an idea. No one is completely clueless, so that's good. And how about our second question? How satisfied are you with your residents' ability to select elective experiences at your program? Please vote now. That's a pretty nice bell curve. Looks like most folks are satisfied, and then a fair number of very satisfied and also somewhat unsatisfied. And finally, how many elective experiences with written goals and objectives do you currently have available to your residents? Please vote now. Okay, looks like most people have voted, and it looks like most folks have somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10, some folks higher, some folks lower, but a pretty good selection. All right. Well, thanks everyone. It helps to know where we're starting from. Here's where we're going. We are hoping that by the end of this session, you'll be able to define elective time and specify how that definition has changed from the past. We want you to be able to design a process whereby the ILP is used as a tool to help select elective experiences. We want you to be able to describe how elective time can be used proactively to create flexible learning opportunities for your residents. And you should be able to delineate the steps needed to create new elective experiences for your residents. A brief overview here of the basic tenets of competency-based medical education. In this model, we start by defining the desired outcome. Then we outline the necessary competencies to achieve that outcome. We build our educational program around that structure with the resident at the center. This model de-emphasizes time spent in favor of skills demonstrated and is driven by learner engagement and community needs. To set the scene, a reminder that there are two major organizations to which we are all beholden who are both invested in CBME. The American Board of Family Medicine determines the requirements for individual board eligibility, including time in clinic, time away, total training time. Pertinent to this presentation are the new core outcomes. The other organization is the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME. They determine the requirements for program accreditation, and in our case, this specifically comes from the Review Committee for Family Medicine. Pertinent to this presentation are the recently updated requirements for learning activities, specifically electives. Starting this summer, the ABFM began to require that program directors certify their graduates in a set of core outcomes, each of which incorporate multiple competencies, verifying that those individuals are well prepared for independent practice. There are a total of 15 core outcomes, which are being rolled out in sets of 5. These were the first 5 outcomes that required verification this past summer. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read them all, but here are those first 5. Here are the 5 outcomes that will be added at the end of this academic year in 2025. And here are the final 5 outcomes to be added in 2026, the year our current interns will graduate. The new ACGME requirement we are focusing on today has to do with the amount of elective experience in residency training, which has been increased to 6 months or 600 hours. And this is a big change from our previous elective requirement, which had been 3 months or 300 hours for many years. And here I'm going to hand things off to Fred to talk more about how we define electives.
Thank you, Lynn, for that outstanding introduction. So as we go through this then, in terms of the electives, the question that we have to ask is, what is an elective? Simply put, it is not a core rotational experience that's required for all residents in your program. And as we discuss these new changes, we want to emphasize that electives now play a more vital role in resident education. This is the 3-year curriculum in my program at Ohio State. All those block rotations in white are required by all of our residents. Those in orange are the elective experiences. A program can distribute the electives across the 3 years in any manner that best suits their curriculum and their residents. In this example, 2 months are in the 2nd year and 4 months of electives are in the 3rd year. The Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education provides more details about the purpose of the elective experiences and how they should be built and selected. It is a group effort of the program director, the faculty, and the residents. Another change in the new requirements is that the elective experience is driven by the resident's individualized learning plan. The elective experiences are purposeful and guided by a faculty member. In this talk, I will refer to this faculty member as a mentor, a coach, or advisor. The electives should be routinely evaluated to ensure they meet the stated purpose of completing the individualized learning plan. More on that in a little bit. Compared to the past, elective experiences have taken a more important role in the resident's training. As noted, they are to provide an opportunity to develop and enhance the competencies identified by the resident and faculty mentor that are needed to serve the resident's future communities. They are also a key component in acquiring the skills of a master adaptive learner. The master adaptive learner has developed the skills of lifelong, self-directed, and self-regulated learning. In competency-based medical education, the resident engages to close the gap between what they know and do not know, and what they can and cannot do. Based on this, the resident, with direction by their faculty mentor, identify additional areas of need that can be met by these elective experiences. The ACGME defines electives as planned learning activities that are integrated into the overall curriculum, are developed around a set of competencies with tailored learning experiences and with significant input from faculty. The elective must have some type of learning experience that is supervised and evaluated and is of sufficient length and content to ensure residents achieve the desired competencies. The tools used for documenting and verifying the experiences should be the same as other required learning experiences. The ACGME FAQs emphasize that the elective experiences should be driven by individualized learning plans, address future practice goals, and require resident-specific pre-planning. This pre-planning includes resident self-awareness, assessment, and reflection on needs to be met with the planned elective rotation. Programs are encouraged to create a list of electives that meet learning goals and competencies of the curriculum. The ACGME does not have a specified number of how many different electives a program should have available. Programs just need to offer at least 6 months of elective experiences. Elective time can be used to address any learning gaps for residents who have not met competency goals, something in the past we labeled as remediation, to address areas of concentration, or to develop specific learning tracks, such as women's health, sports medicine, addiction medicine, and so on. The FAQs clarify that the 6 required months are equivalent to 600 hours of elective experiences. The ACGME also encourages the Program Evaluation Committee to be actively involved in creating, assessing, and improving these elective experiences. So, how does a resident go about choosing their electives? In the past, my experience was that it was not uncommon for the resident to put this decision off to the end or just choose electives based solely on what they envision doing after graduation. However, recall that there are 2 major uses for electives. When selecting an elective, the first question to answer is whether the resident is meeting the required 15 core outcomes as outlined by the American Board of Family Medicine and determined by the program director and the Clinical Competency Committee. If the resident is meeting those core outcomes, the question then to answer is, what can the resident do with the time and resources to further enrich their learning? If the resident is not meeting one or more of these core outcomes, then the question to answer is, what experiences and opportunities does a resident need now in order to get closer to achieving those desired outcomes? As I mentioned in the past, we labeled this as remediation. However, the use of elective time should not be looked upon as punitive, but as a resource for additional opportunities to meet competency mastery and allowing for flexibility within the normal residency training. To illustrate this point, we present to you a case scenario. Resident Jock Doc is a soon-to-be third-year resident who has sights on doing a sports medicine fellowship. The electives this year included 2 months of sports medicine and 1 month of orthopedics. The electives he wants to do in this upcoming year include sports medicine, physical therapy, and rheumatology. However, in his last evaluation by the Clinical Competency Committee, they do not believe he can adequately provide care to a low-risk patient who is pregnant, although he has stated many times he has no interest in including this in his future practice. So the question is, what do you do as a program director? This brings us to the importance of the individualized learning plan when choosing elective experiences. If the resident and faculty coach were meeting regularly, as they should, this deficiency in maternity care would have been identified by now, and a discussion should have ensued as to how the deficiency could be corrected. The ILP should drive the selection of elective experiences taking into account both core outcomes and future practice goals. Here's a basic template of an ILP created by the STFM CBME task force, which is meant to help guide discussions between the resident and faculty coach. The ILP should be individualized, taking into account long-term career and training goals based on learning strengths and struggles, and SMART objectives linked to the core outcomes and objectives. If your program has not yet instituted the ILP, which is a new ACGME requirement, this template can be found at the STFM CBME Toolkit website and can be adapted to the needs of your program. Now, back to the scenario. The question to be answered is, what specific aspects of providing care to a low-risk pregnant patient is the resident lacking? Is it his ability to manage early pregnancy, or common problems during pregnancy, or prenatal care in general, or postpartum care and breastfeedings? Once identified, what can be done to remediate this deficiency prior to graduation? Then how can an elective experience be created to help the resident overcome this deficiency? With this scenario in mind, I would now like to outline the steps in choosing an elective experience. The selection of an elective experience starts with a meeting between the resident and faculty mentor to review the ILP together. If there are identified deficient areas, what needs to be done to rectify the deficiency? Is there an elective already created that can help the resident achieve competency in that core outcome? Recall that a program director cannot graduate a resident who has not met competency in all 15 core outcomes. Next, using the ILP as a guide, identify the resident's personal educational goals and future practice plans. Are there established elective experiences that can satisfy those goals? If so, with the program director's permission, schedule the elective experience. If not, work then needs to be done to create the elective experience using the ACGME criteria that we previously discussed for electives. It is important that residents and faculty understand as a group the essential purposes of elective experiences. We suggest providing this education annually during the mid-year, for example, in January, to allow enough time for the residents and their faculty mentors to identify needed electives. Choosing electives ideally should be done 2 to 3 months prior to the upcoming academic year to allow sufficient time for scheduling and/or development of a new elective. We also recommend that each program have a database or catalog of available elective experiences that residents and faculty can review when selecting electives. For each elective, there should be a description of the experience, written goals, objectives, competencies, and outcomes to be met, supervision and assessment by whom and how often, resources to be used, and opportunities for resident reflection and feedback. We also recommend the program develop a set of default tracks of established electives for those who may desire to craft their future practice in a certain area. Examples of these tracks are listed here. You might also design a default track around specific needs in your community. For example, providing care to those who are HIV positive, which are not specifically required by the ACGME, but might be of high value to the population your residents serve. I will now turn over this session to Lynn, who will describe types of elective experiences, role of the program evaluation committee, and developing a new elective experience. Take it away, Lynn.
There we go. Just double checking that the screen is being shared properly. Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that delay. So let's talk about some ways that you might structure elective experiences. You might make different choices depending on the overall scheduling format of your program or based on the nature of the elective chosen. A block elective is a more concentrated, continuous experience. This would be better for an area where the time scale is shorter, for example, home hospice care, or where concentrated repetition is beneficial, for example, a procedural rotation. A longitudinal elective might look like a half day a week over several months, or even the whole year. A half day a week over 6 months is approximately equivalent to a 4-week rotation. This might be better for an area where the time scale is longer, for example, an eating disorder clinic or a gender care clinic. It might also be helpful for a long-term project, such as a research project or area of concentration. Some programs might offer an away elective rotation, typically meaning something done outside the home health care system and potentially internationally. Residents typically appreciate having these types of opportunities, but there are a few things to consider. You'll need to set up an educational contract that includes coverage for malpractice. You'll also need to consider the time away from the program and ensure that the resident will still be able to get 40 weeks in their continuity clinic. If a resident also takes 4 weeks of vacation in the same year that they do a 4-week away rotation, that only leaves you a 2-week buffer for any issues such as unexpected illness. In addition, GME dollars typically follow the resident, and as such, the DIO often needs to provide approval. Remember that in all cases, whether the elective experience is set up as a block or longitudinal rotation, and whether it is within your system or away, it must meet all the criteria required by the ACGME. It must have written goals and objectives linked to competencies and outcomes. It must be supervised by a member of the faculty to ensure the quality of teaching. It must have a method for evaluation and feedback, both for the attending and the resident. It needs to have adequate supportive resources. And of course, as we keep saying, it should support the residents' long-term learning or future practice goals as outlined by their ILP. Your program evaluation committee should be reviewing all elective experiences annually as part of the annual program evaluation to ensure that all these requirements are being met. So, how should you go about developing a new elective? We'd like to suggest the following process. Remember that in CBME, we start with the outcome. So, what is the desired outcome? What skill or knowledge needs to be gained? Is the resident closing a competency gap or pursuing a passion area? What gap in their ILP are you trying to fill that won't otherwise be covered in your standard curriculum? Once you have a well-defined outcome, begin to address the ACGME requirements. Start by writing out the goals and objectives and link them to competencies and outcomes. Make these practical and realistic and very focused on the specific skills or knowledge to be gained. The more targeted your goals and objectives, the easier it will be to measure when they've been attained, both for the teacher and the learner. At this point, you can establish a team of residents and faculty to complete the work of establishing the elective. Identify a member of the faculty who will be responsible for oversight. This does not have to be someone involved in the teaching of the elective. It can be a faculty member willing to act as a liaison between the program and the instructor. Determine how you'll evaluate the rotation and how the resident will get feedback. Remember that this can include self-assessment in addition to the more traditional forms and surveys. And in some cases, self-assessment might be the best way to determine whether those goals and objectives were met. Ensure the resident has the resources needed to be successful. This might include readings, videos, practice models, and other learning materials, but don't forget the essentials of time and space to work as well. Once you have all these things written out, present your proposal to the PEC and obtain final approval from the PD. And don't forget to follow up. Ensure that there is a plan to check and adjust the experience as feedback is collected. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions or for folks to share their particular successes or challenges. Please utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you haven't already, and we will get through as many comments and questions as we can. And Fred, we have one that popped up while you were talking already. I'll read it out for us, and then we can both take a look at it. The question is, if a learning gap is identified at the end of the first year, is the guidance to use second year elective time in the early part of the second year? Or should we extend the first year with additional elective time moved from second year to first year prior to promoting to second year? I have some thoughts. I think it would come down to what criteria your program has identified for promotion. I would say if that resident is otherwise meeting criteria for promotion, you might go ahead and promote them and then use that second year elective time for filling that competency gap. If, however, they are not meeting criteria for promotion, then you would want to extend their first year because they have not yet shown that they are ready to be a second year. But that does depend on your program having pretty clear criteria outlined. What do you think, Fred?
Yeah, I agree, Lynn. I think every program should clearly have written criteria for what is needed to be met before they move from the first year to second year and from the second year to the third year to make it clear to the residents what they need to do. Now, there are some things that a resident may be falling behind that clearly could be remediated through another experience in that second year as an elective. However, if you make a criteria that the resident, let's say, for example, on the inpatient service, should be able to not only take care of a set number of patients, but also be able to do it without direct supervision immediately available, then you may need to extend them. Or you could let them move on to the second year, but do something with their elective time to allow them to show that they are capable of doing so. So it really depends upon how deficient the area is. But I would say that at least during that first year, if there are some areas that are identified, those could easily be rectified by adding more time as an elective in the second year. So that's what would be my guidance.
Great, I agree with that for sure. We have a new question from Janice Benson, who asks, we have established tracks that have a certificate at graduation. If residents wish to swap out part of the track, are we in error to not give them their certificate at graduation? So I'm interpreting that to mean that the track is establishing an area of concentration, so they would then earn like an additional certificate to say that they did additional training in that thing. I mean, I think it depends how lenient you want to be. At our program, we would probably allow them to swap it out as long as it was an equivalent experience that we felt still accomplished the additional training needed for that certificate or area of concentration. But I hope I'm interpreting that question correctly. What are your thoughts, Fred?
Yeah, so Janice, I think that, now that we have gone from 3 to 6 months for elective time, I would encourage programs, if they want to do this with certificates, that they not rely upon all 6 months of additional training to be used to get that certificate. You may want to limit it to 4 electives or as a track, or 5 to allow for some leniency with the use of an elective in another area. I was always tried to be full of grace and mercy, and I think not pinning myself in a hole allowed me not to have to be the judge all the time. So I think if you have that certificate and limit it to maybe 4 or 5 additional elective months in that time, and that they demonstrate those competencies, I see no problem with giving them the certificate at the end of their graduation in that area.
Oh, thank you, Janice. She says both responses were helpful. We have an anonymous question. Is there a document or resource available that provides a template for rotation curricula? We are planning to revamp all of ours and would appreciate any guidance or examples you can share. Thank you. Well, so we actually just recently did a faculty development session at my program where we utilized some templates that we were generously given by Ray Wright, who is one of the STFM task force members. I'm actually not sure if those are part of the toolkit or if those are things that she's developed on her own. But I will check with her, and I'm sure we'll be able to maybe share those as well. Do you know of any that are posted on the toolkit, Fred, or elsewhere?
Yeah, you're talking about the AFMRD toolkit area. Yeah, I would think that there are examples. If not, I will check with the toolkit area, and if not, we'll get some on there. I think it's a big task in order to revamp curricula, and I think having templates help. Each other sharing our own examples really helps a lot. But I would first look in at AFMRD toolkit or the toolbox on the website to check.
Yeah. And I would strongly encourage doing that as a faculty development. I thought our session was really successful. Getting all of the faculty involved in writing out the goals and objectives and writing out the details of the curriculum really helps them to be aware of what the requirements are, and also how we're meeting them, and also have visibility on what other folks are doing in other areas of the curriculum. It was just a really rich session for us because we also have a lot of newer career faculty who are still kind of getting all this stuff figured out. So definitely, decide on a template that your program is going to use and then have a nice development session around it.
Yeah, I do know that there are examples of various rotation templates in the FMRD toolbox. I put one in a while back on care of the eye, ophthalmology. And at that time, we didn't have the core outcomes. So what would be useful is not only add the competencies that are to be learned during that rotation, but also what core outcomes will be met by successfully meeting or successfully completing that rotation. I know that the STFM task force has just recently completed a nice Excel spreadsheet that lists the milestone competencies along with the core outcomes and put which of the core outcomes are and meet with the milestones. And those are really nice in terms of being able to match those up. And that should be on that rotation too, is what are the core outcomes that are to be met and the milestones or the clinical competencies that are to be met. But that's good. That's a good question, and we'll make sure that we have some examples.
Yeah, we can post some things associated with the webinar, so we'll make sure we do that. Thank you for the question. We have a question about leaves, Fred,
Yeah.
and of course there's the recent changes to the leave requirements and allowances that makes this all more confusing. So the question is, there was recently discussion on the AFMRD listserv about resident family medical leave and electives. Some said they keep the required program rotations, while others said they keep the electives. Guidance? Should elective time trump program required rotations? What do you think, Fred?
Well, I'm going to put out a disclaimer that I do not sit on the RC. And I do not speak for the RC that outline these requirements. The thing to keep in mind is that electives are required. You have to offer at least 6 months of elective experiences. And then you've got those core required experiences that the resident needs to demonstrate competency in. If a person takes the let's say 12 weeks total, takes the total of 20 weeks over the 3 years, which they could do if they follow the ABFM guidelines on maternity, paternity, or sick leave, those types of things for personal time away. That's 20 weeks out of the total of the 156 weeks of the rotation. So I think that there's a way you can craft it so that you still get the elective experiences done, those 6 months, but it may be in areas that because they didn't meet some of the required rotations, you could pick up with the electives. Because the electives are there, as we talked about, is not only to enhance the residents' learning and their future goals, but also to make up for any areas that they may not be competent in. And if they miss let's say a required rotation that you have for all your residents in a certain area, then the way I look at it is you could use one of those electives to make up for that experience. Because that, again, we have the two reasons for that elective. It's to further the training for future based on the ILP, but also to make up for any areas that they may not be competent in those core outcomes. So that's how I look at it, is that you can use those 6 electives as part of your requirement makeup time if they're not going to get all that in. But again, you have 156 weeks of that. Your 24 weeks of that, the 6 months, is meant to be for elective time. And you've got all that other time to fit in those requirements. So I think if you take those 20 weeks away, you're still able to kind of massage that experience.
Yeah.
That was a good question. I enjoyed watching the responses, because it is I admit it's a confusing area, and I'm sure that eventually the RC will address that in one of their FAQs, and I will direct that question to the RC myself in terms of that.
It's a sticky one. I know we're all confused about exactly how to work out things out with the leaves. And I was thinking as you were talking too, Fred, it's ultimately about that North Star of the competencies and outcomes. Can you certify that this person is ready for independent practice in this area? And so you need to build the rotations to that goal. And whether you call them required or you call them electives, you need to get them educated to the place where they can practice independently. So that might be a different sort of philosophy to look at it with. See, we don't have any further questions coming up. Anyone else have something to share? We're also happy to listen to success stories or suggestions or abysmal failures. Anyone having difficulty with this?
As people are thinking, Lynn, the thing, again, in my years of being a program director, the thing that these new guidelines emphasize to me is the importance that electives now are in a curriculum. Again, as in the past, over the last 20 years or so, there was always a number that you had to offer 3 months minimum. A maximum of 6 months were the early ones, and no more than half of those could be used for remediation or let's say doing another required rotation over. And I think the philosophy has really changed in how we look at electives, that they really are not to be used as placeholders, but really are meant to look at the resident where they are, where they need to be, and where they want to be, and how can those 6 months, those 600 hours or 24 weeks of time be used for that resident to be at a level so that when they graduate, you can entrust them to independently go into practice. And I think that's why I like this new philosophy of electives. Yeah, it makes it a little bit harder in order to come up with some really good criteria. But I do think using that, the frequency of meetings with the resident and their faculty advisor, mentor, coach, and using the kind of the individualized learning plan will help the resident and faculty member choose the right electives for them.
All right, we've had some new questions pop up. Francis Chu has a question. We previously had medical and surgical subspecialty selectives where residents could choose from a list of subspecialties. Would this still be considered an elective under the new requirements? You want to take that one first, Fred?
Sure. Yeah, we had the same thing as selectives. I think it can be. You know, the ACGME and the RC and their most recent requirements has kind of de-emphasized the nitty-gritty details of what goes into some of the requirements. And if you have a selective, which means that the resident can pick and choose, let's say if they want more ENT or more, let's say ophthalmology or some surgical subspecialty, that I would look upon as an elective, because as long as you're taking into account what the resident foresees in their future. So let's say they see themselves going into more of a rural practice where they will be doing a lot more hands-on procedures, then you could have, you know, an elective procedure month that not only accomplishes what you want for the resident curriculum, but also for their future practice. So I think that you know, that again, with that aspect that I'm not on the RC, I would think that would count as an elective under the new requirements.
I agree. We at our program have a similar situation where we had a long list of subspecialty selectives, and we are now calling those the electives, and the residents can choose from those because they're pre-established. You've got everything kind of already set up. And it's as long as you're still meeting those requirements though. So as long as it's you know, in line with your ILP and your future goals, as long as you have all the goals and objectives written out, and as long as you have a faculty supervisor. For us at our program, that's where we're having to do some extra work right now, is we had all those things set up, but we don't necessarily have the right goals and objectives written out. We need to kind of revamp those. And we don't necessarily have a direct faculty member assigned to each subspecialty, which you really do need to have. So those are some areas of work for us this year. And, you know, that's kind of a nice segue to the next one, who says it's really a challenge to stay on top of ensuring electives are appropriately planned and approved. It's easiest to have a curated set of electives that are pre-approved by the PD. Residents and their faculty coaches are understandably busy, and it takes a lot of foresight that is especially challenging for administratively challenged learners. That's funny to me. We are definitely seeing some administration challenges. I would say at our program, we have a curated set of electives that I call the default electives. And we have a way to opt in or out of other electives in our catalog via a survey, the form that they can complete. And if they make no choices, they get the default. And, you know, as Fred kind of mentioned, I do find there are a number of residents who are either administratively overwhelmed or don't have the sort of foresight to make their own choices and are perfectly happy with the default things. And I think that's okay. What do you think, Fred?
I totally agree. Yeah. You know, it's mentioned a lot. It's been mentioned more than once by Dr. Newton and others that perfection is an enemy of getting things accomplished often. And we're faced with a lot of new requirements that are, for some, very time consuming. And it's going to take us a while to get to perfection. So I would say, yes, having a curated list is great. You have to keep in mind, though, that the ultimate goal is that resident going to be able to accomplish those 15 core outcomes. That should be the driving forces when they select their electives. Is there an area deficient that they just need more time in, that they're going to have to take that elective to get up to speed in that area. Otherwise, I think it's just going to, you know, just chip away at as you can, changing the kind of the culture of the expectation, it's hard because it takes time. But I do think putting some emphasis on the importance of it will help change that culture a bit, slowly at a time, over time. So yeah, I totally agree. Having a set is good. But always keep in mind when those electives are chosen, those questions that I mentioned is the resident meeting all those 15 core outcomes? And if so, they can do whatever elective they choose. And if they're not, then you're going to have to use some of those in order for them to get up to meeting those competencies.
Our next question is to do with the time requirement. When it says months, is it mostly about the time spent? Does it have to be a literal block/month, or could a concentrated 2 weeks with the same amount of time that they would usually get in a more traditional 4 weeks count? And I would say it is about the time spent. It doesn't have to be counted in months. You could count it in hours, right? It's 6 months or 600 hours. So I think if you were still getting the time in, either way would count. Is that right, Fred?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as long as you meet the hour requirement. Also, I think that the thing to keep in mind is that concentrated 2 weeks going to be sufficient in order for them to accomplish the learning needs of whatever that elective is. So it does not have to be a month. It could be 2 weeks. It could be you could have 4 1-week electives in various areas and still count those as that 100 hours over time too. Or you could do, let's say, 1 week, a quarter over 6 months. You've got the flexibility. So I don't think there's a one way fits all. You can spread it out as you decide, just so long as the resident has the opportunity of having 600 hours over those 3 years to do elective experiences.
Yep. Or as we mentioned in the presentation, a half day a week for 6 months is equivalent to that 4 weeks. So however you want to break it up, whatever works for your scheduling, knowing that we all have very different ways of doing that scheduling.
Yeah, so one way we did, like say the longitudinal elective, is that we took our residents a half day out of the office time that they normally would have and let them do their elective longitudinally over the year. But then we took that elective time and made it a family medicine month so that they could get their, at that time, numbers, but at least get the experience in the office. So there's ways you can creatively structure your rotations so that you can spread that out over time and still not do it at a sacrifice to the amount of time that they're seeing their own patients in the office.
All right. That's all of the questions that were posted. I think we do still have a couple more minutes. Any last call for questions? Okay, should we wrap up? Going once, going twice? All right. Well, let me just give you a summary then of the takeaway points that we hope you'll leave with. Again, the ACGME now requires 6 months or 600 hours of elective time. Elective choices are driven by each resident's individualized learning plan and should address the needs of future practice goals, which includes taking into account any areas where the resident is not meeting core outcomes. The resident and their faculty advisor or coach should make those choices together, and the plan should be approved by the PD. Every elective should have written goals, learning objectives, competencies and outcomes to be met, have adequate resources, be supervised, and have timely evaluation and feedback. And the program evaluation committee should assess each elective during the annual program evaluation. One last poll. We'd love to know how well we addressed our objectives today. Please give us some feedback. Oh, very good. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time. Thanks very much for coming with us. Looks like folks are overall pretty satisfied with our goals and objectives today. Let me just share a big thank you for spending your time with us. We do welcome questions. Fred and I, here are our contact details and some references. And all the slides will, of course, be posted on the SDFM website. Thanks, everybody.